Okay, so good morning everyone. I want to change the pace and the direction a little bit from what we've talked about so far today and look at what I've called the modern workplace, an example there from a project which has already been talked about, the BBC, something HOK have been involved with for a number of years, and really asking, I guess, a controversial question: why bother? Why bother with all of this funky, snazzy, expensive design? What does it achieve, and perhaps are we focusing in the wrong areas? So just to give you a bit of context about me, my organisation, and kind of where I come from and what I do, I really class my first job as being a dad, playmate, climbing frame, dog's body and everything else to my two young daughters. In between the times when I get to do that, I come to HOK, where I'm the regional leader of consulting for the EMEA region. And there's a reason I've told you in that order, which I'll come on to later. So perhaps you're thinking, well, HOK, big architectural firm, globally recognised as a designer, perhaps a slightly career-limiting move coming to a conference like this and suggesting that the whole philosophy of design is a bit of a waste of time. So just to give you some context about myself, I originally trained as a quantity surveyor, so perhaps a square peg in a round hole, working for an organisation like HOK. Spent a number of years working client-side, working in contractor organisations, before moving into broader consultancy roles, working in FM consultancy, probably the biggest achievement, taking John Lewis into the Channel Islands and introducing a completely different FM operating model for them to do that. And in most recent times with HOK, where I've been for the last 2 years, predominantly looking at how organisations use and get the most from their workplace and how we really enable the people within those spaces to use it properly. So what this session isn't about is a sales pitch about great design and how we should embrace it. And what it's really about is how we should collectively plan a workplace to get the most from it. So, as I said, great design, what does it mean? Many things to many different people. Again, this is one of our own from New Broadcasting House at BBC. But I guess from my perspective, not being a designer, are we window dressing? Are we spending lots of money on external facades? And a few other examples from other designers just to prove that this isn't an out-and-out sales pitch. Picking up on Les's point earlier, and I'm going to conform exactly to type with the obsession with data, and I'm going to throw some statistics at you to start this off. HOK did some work in the financial services sector last year. We did a benchmarking report looking at London, New York and Toronto, and looking at how financial services organisations within those locations use their space. Now, the QSME can't help but coming out at this point and starting to apply some costs to these things. I'm going to put my hand up now and say that there's probably some flaws, there's probably some inaccuracies in some of the details I'm going to give you. But if you go with that and just let me get to the point I want to make at the end and the magnitude of what I want to make, hopefully it will make sense. So 2 of the findings which come out of our study, first of all, that almost half of all seats in the financial services sector are not occupied at any one time. Half. Quite a significant number. For me, what's more interesting is when we start to look at the utilisation level of meeting rooms. Only a third. Really interesting when every organisation I've worked with will claim to have problems with meeting room bookings. So perhaps suggesting that this is more of a cultural issue than a space one. So if we look at Canary Wharf as an example, there's circa 14 million square feet of office and commercial space across the wharf. Our own research has shown that in a typical office, about 50% is allocated to workstations. So if we do some very simple maths, about 25% of that 14 million square foot is not being occupied at any one time. If we take some very simple market rents, that equates to £126 million. £126 million being spent on leasing space which isn't being used. When we then throw in the meeting rooms, from our surveys we've identified that they typically take up about 11 to 12% of an organisation's space. If we run the metrics again, there's another 39 million there. So whether you agree with the detail of the logic, that's £165 million worth of hypothetical space in Canary Wharf which isn't being used. So even if you apply a 30-40% margin of error to that, I think it's still quite fitting that perhaps we're focusing on the wrong areas. So then let's look at the spaces we do use. And Les teed this up nicely for me earlier with his reference to Leesman. I'm one of the Leesman consulting partners in the UK. Have been working with them for 5 or 6 years now since their inception. So helping develop the tool, helping do research with the tool, and then deploying it on the various clients we work with. And what we've got here is a typical screenshot of what comes out of the survey. This is actually looking at the whole population. So almost 90,000 people, about 4 to 6 weeks ago, who have taken the survey. Very simply, what it's telling us on the left-hand side are a number of features within the workplace. The length of the bar is telling us how many people have said those features are important. Simply, the coloration is giving us a degree of satisfaction. How well are those features supporting the individuals in the workplace? The one I've highlighted there is temperature control. So we can see, relatively speaking, it's important to most people, and yet, despite the vast amounts of money we're spending on fitting out, on maintaining, looking after buildings, still only 1 in 4 people are happy with the temperature control of their building. Just take a step back. We're spending millions of pounds on space we don't use. We're spending millions of pounds on services which aren't necessarily satisfying people within the workplace. So, in the same way that I tried to introduce myself today, my point is that perhaps we should be thinking more about people and less about function and what they do. So again, just to put some statistics and some context on that, and again you'll see why I studied quantity surveying in the first instance, the obsessions with the numbers and the graphs. This is from some research I did with a colleague at TTSP about 5 or 6 years ago, looking at the value of real estate in an overall organisation. And what we established, in a typical service-based organisation, real estate accounts for about 15% of the operating costs. Once you've taken out rents, rates and service charges, which are typically 80% of that, the bit that we as a group here can physically touch, can physically influence, is about 3%, 20% of the 15%. So what about the rest of the costs? 70% of that relates to labour. So let's put that into a slightly different context. And that's a little bit early in the day, but it's one I understand, and I'm sure some of you will as well. If we're having to put this much effort into our labour, we're only putting this much into our property, and by comparison, via pictogram, this much into the bit we can physically touch. Now, in this scenario, if you want maximum effect, I can assure you from experience that you get it from here, not from over here. Now, if we're talking in the pub, we're talking about how quickly, how easily we can get drunk. If we're talking about organisations, we're talking exactly what Les mentioned earlier. How do we be a business enabler? This isn't about bricks and mortar. This isn't about air conditioning. This is how do we support the business to be successful. So, at that point, you may well be thinking, am I coming to a conclusion? Am I saying, well, this is the end of workplace design? Should we scrap it? Should we go back to basics? Actually not. So if we come back to the people argument, one of the biggest discussions at the moment within HR, within the wider business, is the subject of attraction and retention. Quite often talked about as one subject, but in reality 2 different subjects. How you attract someone to an organisation is very different to how you retain them. But both independently and together, something we as a sector need to really think about and understand how, through what we do in workplace, what we do in FM, we can enable our organisations and our clients to attract and retain their staff. Again, to give some context of that, top talent globally is shrinking. In every region, the pool of talent which we all have access to is diminishing on a year-on-year basis. In 2050, some of the research we've done has predicted that in Germany, the talent pool would have dropped by 25%, in Italy by 30%, in Japan by 38%. So it's no good to stand still. If we want access to that top talent, we need to do something different, and we need to do it now. So that's really about attracting. How do we then retain people? Depending on which research you look at, the cost of recruitment can be anything up to 50% of an average salary. The average salary in London sits just under £49,000. So again, if you rely on those statistics, every time we recruit someone into an organisation, it's costing that organisation £20,000. And we've already heard from some of my colleagues today how many employees they had, and it doesn't take a genius to work out how that cost can start ramping up very quickly in a big corporate organisation. This is without even thinking about the effects this will then have on their colleagues. What message does it send when somebody leaves the organisation? What about market perception? We're in a world which is now governed and led by social media. No longer do our internal comms and PR teams hold the information and are the gateway to what the world thinks of us. Before anything can be released from a comms department, it's typically already on Facebook, Twitter, and the various other social media feeds which exist. And then there's the work which goes with people. People are loyal to people, not to organisations. And I'm sure you've all got experiences of this where you have either followed an individual or you as an individual have moved from one company to another and your vendors, your clients, etc. have come with you. So what is the cost of all of that to business? So how do we reverse this? How do we start to get people to come and stay within the organisation? How do we get people to want to work with the organisations we work with? Now, most exit interviews will tell you that workplace, that facilities, all of the things we're involved with typically don't feature on the top 4 or 5 things of why somebody would join or would leave an organisation. Typically, it's around remuneration, it's about location and nature of work. If we start to drill down into the psychology of why somebody joins an organisation, why they would want to work for one organisation over another, typically people are looking for organisations who build their cultures, their brands, their ethos on things which mirror their own. And this is particularly true with the generations who are coming up. Gone are the days where somebody would come in at 18, stay with an organisation for 40 or 50 years. If an individual doesn't feel that that organisation represents their beliefs, their way of working, the things that they're passionate about, then the younger generation will quite happily move to another organisation which does. So if we start to look at some of these words up here and we look at things like freedom, collaboration, inspiration, I think maybe, just maybe, there is a role we can play in workplace to help foster this environment. So I'm going to take this opportunity to, for the one and only time to be Doctor Who in my life for a very short period of time, and take you on a time journey. So first of all, I'd like us to go back to university years and appreciate it's probably a slightly longer journey for some of you than others, not looking in any direction in particular. And if we think about what we did at university, from personal experience, the image in the top left probably represents what I did most successfully at university. If we sway away from that and come back to the learning and the things we took away from university, certainly when I was there 19 years ago, we had 2 key environments where we could learn, where we could work. It was the classroom and it was the library. And I guess in one way I'm fortunate enough to have lived through an era where I've started to see the introduction of all of these new things, the introduction of technology, the introduction of different workspaces. So during my journey at university and then coming back to university to do a master's degree several years later, we started to see the use of coffee shops, informal collaboration spaces, perhaps open spaces, and in more recent times within universities, informal collaboration spaces, a subject which is very much a hot topic in the higher ed sector at the moment, given that the student is now the student's parents, I should say, are now effectively the client and are paying for that experience. So the demands those students' parents want are significantly increased. The point here is, all through university, the work we did, the work which is still done, is activity and deadline focused. So as a student, you're given a piece of work, you're told what you need to do, when it needs to be given in. It's not dictated to you where you sit, how you do it, who you do it with. The reality is, most people probably ignore all of these and it's done in the box over here, which is 11 o'clock the night before it's due in. But all of those students, including myself, got the work in, they got their degree and they went on to get employed. So clearly it works. So back into the time machine, and I want to take you a few years further back. First car. So for me, it was a 1983 1.6 Vauxhall Astra, I say proudly. Not looking quite as good as that one, although unfortunately I couldn't find any pictures. If you think about your first car, whatever it was, whenever it was, what do you remember about it? Was it the dents and the rust? Was it perhaps the dodgy radio? Perhaps the leaky sunroof? Or was it what it meant to you? It meant that you suddenly had freedom. You had the ability to go where you wanted, when you wanted. You had choice. And all of these things, rust, leaky, I was going to say leaky radio, that would be an interesting one, leaky sunroof, broken radio, all of those things were irrelevant because you were empowered to be able to make a choice. You may not have decided to go out, but still that was your choice. And we can go back a step before that when we start to get where some of these human characteristics are first formed. As I mentioned earlier, I have 2 daughters. This is my eldest, Lauren. about a year ago, very proudly riding her first bike. And that feeling of riding a first bike is very much the same as that feeling of owning a first car. It's about freedom, it's about choice, it's about empowerment. It's about that ability to go where you want, when you want. Now, having two daughters, I couldn't show one without the other. So this is my youngest, Sophie. About 12 months ago, when we were first brave enough to give her a plate of spaghetti without feeding her. And what this really demonstrates to me is that these things are human traits. They're ingrained within our culture, they're ingrained in our DNA. And as you can see here, the way she's eaten her spaghetti, probably not quite as successful as if my wife or myself had been feeding her. But there was a sense of empowerment. She had done that for herself. She had chosen how to eat that. She had chosen her own actions. And as I said, this is something which is very much ingrained in human culture, human behaviour. So if we step out of the time machine and come back to the modern day and come back to the workplace, which I guess is why we're all here today, what I've done here is collected a number of different words which come up time and time again in the vision sessions we do with various organisations. We work in the financial sector, we work in the pharmaceutical sector, we work in the education sector. And the messages which come up in each sector are, give or take, almost identical and always consistent. And if we look at some of the words on there, the size of the word really dictates the number of times that that's come up in the vision sessions we run. But if we start thinking about things like variety, choice, varying, balance, freedom, perhaps we can start to see how we could use the workplace as an opportunity for encouraging and for promoting this atmosphere, this place, which will enable people to work in the way they would like to and the way we're designed to. And this isn't just me saying this from work we've done with our clients. This is backed up with academic research. So this is the summary of something which was done by Dr. Craig Knight, formerly of Exeter University, where in laboratory conditions, he took a group of individuals and gave them a set of tasks around memos and letters. 4 different groups, 4 different environments. The first one, a bare environment, where they were just put into a sterile office, enriched, where perhaps there was some colour, perhaps some greenery, some images on the wall. Empowered, where they were fully empowered to design that workplace as they see fit. And then finally compromised, where they were first of all given the opportunity to customise that workplace and then had certain things taken away. And as you can see from the lines, the bars on there, the group who were empowered were able to do those tasks the quickest. So again, a degree of academic research suggesting that if people have choice, variety, flexibility, that they can be more productive. And I'm not going to get into what productive means because as we were talking before, I think it's a very subjective word and there isn't a single answer for a single organisation. What became really interesting for me was then when we started looking at this research and looking at the number of errors. You would expect as somebody does something quicker, the number of errors goes up. Actually quite the opposite. So the group who were empowered, the group who completed these tasks the quickest, actually did so with the least amount of errors. So again, demonstrating that there is some science behind what I'm telling you today. So I guess the key message is about providing choice and treating people as individuals. And as an individual, I've been quite fortunate over the last 4 or 5 years to have done an extensive amount of work with Saracens Rugby Club, who, in my opinion, and recent form has, I guess, added some credentials to this, proven that they are one of the most forward-thinking, successful sports clubs, certainly rugby clubs. And a big part of that is the ethos they've got and the way they look after their players. They have a sports psychology program called Caring for and Looking After People, not players, people. So their program thinks about their people in the most holistic way. It thinks about them as players, it thinks about them as parents, it thinks about them as partners, it thinks about their education, and as a club, they try to look after every single part of that player's life. And in turn to that, they get the commitment and they get the performance back from those players when they're on the pitch. And I've kind of borrowed the format of this slide from something which David Jones, who I work with at Saracens, uses, where he has pictures of Sjouk Brits and Steve Borthwick, 2 very, very successful international rugby players. Both reached the pinnacle of their game, both played for their country, both won awards, but both very, very different in the way they train, the way they think, the way they act. HOK, very much the joker, will be the person who turns up to training late, will be the last person to board an aeroplane, quite often making the whole plane delayed, will be found eating sweets midway through training, has no interest in the details of the fitness regime. Steve Borthwick, by comparison, very, very methodical. Wants to know what time they need to be at the airport, what time the flight is, what gate it's going to be on. Wants to not only know the details of the training regime, but understand why they're doing each individual component. And the point of this is it illustrates that it's possible to get to the absolute top of a game from two very different perspectives. So using that analogy, I use myself and one of my colleagues, Lara, who works with me in our London office. We both do a very similar job. We're both very similar in age, which again, I think dispels this myth we seem to have created as a sector that everybody can be put into one of these age groups, that if you're a Gen Y, you do this, if you're a Gen X, you do that. It's flawed. Because even within those generations, there are different personality traits, there are different ways of learning. I have more in common with some people in my organisation who are 25 years older than me than I do some those within a few year age gap because of the way we work. And so to demonstrate this, what we did was we looked at our office. This is our London office just at the north end of Tottenham Court Road. And over a period of a few days, we tracked our movements. So over here on the right-hand side, you've got the bank of desks where we sit. And these were my movements over the course of a day. So apart from doing lots of walking, using lots of different settings in lots of different places. If we then compare that to what Lara does on the same day, it's a very different profile. So demonstrating similar role, similar age, but a very different way of working. So with that, we need to think about how we provide choice for people and how we allow them to be individuals. So in wrapping that up in some points which you can hopefully take away or question and quiz me on for the next 10, 15 minutes. I think as an organisation supplying consultancy services to clients, those of you who work within client organisations servicing your internal clients, I think we all have a responsibility to create a workplace that supports and represents the organisation's behaviour. And when we say this, we don't think about the slides and the other gizmos that we see in some of the more modern tech companies. It's really about getting under the skin, understanding the culture, understanding what that organisation wants to represent and how that can be done through space. It supports people equally but differently. So as we've moved through the journey of workplace, we seem to go, and Yahoo is a good example of this, from everybody in the office to everybody out of the office to everybody back in the office. And actually most people sit between those two bookmarks and don't want to be dictated to in either direction. So as an organisation, as clients, consultants providing services to organisations, it's about coming up with facilities, it's about coming up with workplaces which allow people to have that variety and that individual choice. And most importantly, and I didn't run this past our design director before I left this morning, it's always function before form. If we get the function right, we can then let the designers do the weird and wonderful things they do, which really bring an environment alive. But it absolutely has to be function first. And then with that, a sense of where I feel we collectively are as an industry. A different world requires a different solution, not the way it's always been done. And in order to do this, it's going to require lots of people, lots of organisations to take some quite big and what could be seen as bold steps to change this, rather than the kind of small incremental ones that we're taking at the moment. Thank you.
Very thought-provoking. Any questions for Steve? And start with who you are.
A really good or a really bad job.
Yeah.
If I might, we were chatting before just about productivity, and there's been a lot of research done in the UK, going back into the 80s and 90s, about how to measure this thing called productivity. And you and I swapped a few stories, and it was interesting that you gave an analogy about how you actually measure an outcome of a workplace. And I just wanted to ask you, are there other ones that you've experienced, but also just give another example. And the National Australia Bank have their headquarters in Melbourne, Australia. I don't know if you've seen their workplace, but it's quite interconnected. They found one of their measurements was that they were able to resolve customer queries, complaints and problems, and they took the period down from 13 minutes down to 7 minutes. So again, if you want to talk about productivity, it's really an output for the customer. On the other hand, it's because people were interacting with one another, able to get an answer quickly. From your experience, what are some other sorts of measures that people can talk to as far as outcomes and outputs are concerned?
So it's a really good point, and we generally promote the use of a balanced scorecard when we're trying to justify, and coming back to what was talked about earlier, put a return on investment on the work we're doing and the subsequent implementations which would need to take place. And if I give you an example from a bank we're working with at the moment, down in Canary Wharf, who are going through a significant rationalisation, if I can call it that, of their estate. One of the things we established very early on with their leadership team was that the lack of spaces, or the lack of private spaces, was restricting or slowing down how quick decisions could be made. So this organisation had got themselves into a culture where, if very much a traditional work setting, workstations and meeting rooms, despite the statistics, and they actually conform to this, apparently you can never book a meeting room. So what would happen is, when somebody wanted to talk to a senior manager, they would book a meeting. To book a meeting, it would sometimes be 3 or 4 days away, because that was the next time the space was available. So something we've worked with that organisation is providing a lot more informal and non-bookable spaces, and we've gone in and we've retested after the event. And some of these measures are always going to be subjective, but the perception is that the additional spaces we've put in have improved the speed at which decisions are made. But around productivity, our approach is very much to tease that out of the initial sessions we do with our client, to understand what's important to them. Because even I do a lot in the banking sector and the pharmaceutical sector, and even in those two sectors, as you talked about earlier, what's important for one client in one sector could perhaps be subtly different to another.
Thank you.
We're here to...
Name,
Sorry, Guy Pritchard Davis. We're here in Park State to celebrate World FM, and I suspect the vast majority of people in the group represent that field. And it's great to have a design company mixing in that field. Firstly, a statement. I'm a great believer that everything that is done in life should be designed. And if it's not, you'll probably end up somewhere else haphazardly. When one's talking about workplace, there are a number of different components that go into a successful workplace that adds value and contributes. What do you think the components are from a design perspective, thinking about FM, thinking about IT? What are the components that you feel are important when exploring the opportunity to create value and productivity? Which comes back to, in part, why bother, but design doesn't stand on its own. It's a mixture of...
If I can just come back to the point you made first about design, I think it's quite a broad word. So I would agree with you, absolutely everything has to be designed, but I would say it's functional design before form design. And when I say form design, it's aesthetics. In terms of the second point you raised, I would say the biggest thing is flexibility. So there are certain things which my architectural colleagues will put into spaces from a work setting perspective, which may be some form of piece of furniture with chairs around it, which can be moved around. That only works if the building is enabled for those pieces of furniture and those settings to be moved around. So the lighting, so the flow of traffic, making sure that the air conditioning and mechanical systems work. So it's at the absolute outset, working collectively as a team, designers, client, strategy people, I guess, like myself, and the people who are going to operate and run that building, to understand that what we do on day one, how that can then be adjusted on day 2, day 3, day 4.
And generally, when you are taking the brief, strategizing about the brief and what the outcomes of it are, do you generally have facilities people? And the answer could be yes, but are facilities people at that table at an early stage, or do they get brought in at a later stage?
No, I would say they generally are brought in at an early stage. That would be part of our recommendation. If we didn't put that forward as an option, I'm not sure how many of our clients would suggest that we talk to FM at that stage, which I think is where your kind of question is.
Okay.
I'm in retirement care. You've done a lot of surveys there and research. In your opinion, of the FM provision in a building, which parts of that FM are clients least happy with and, in your opinion, need most work on improving in?
Temperature control is the obvious one, which I think will come as no surprise. Interestingly, the data from the Leesman survey does not show any variance depending on the type of building, whether it's naturally ventilated, mechanically ventilated, new build, retro build. And some work I've done has kind of illustrated, obviously, if you take people out of cellular offices and you put them into open plan, their satisfaction of temperature will generally go down because they've gone from an environment where they have individual temperature control to an environment where they're now sitting at a kind of a static medium temperature, which half the people will be too hot, half will be too cold. What I have seen work really well is if you then push that flexibility to the absolute end and implement a flexible environment, because there will naturally be hot and cold points within a floor. And if you then empower people, it comes back to choice again, to be able to move around that floor and find the spots which suit them on a personal level, that is a much more engaging and cost-effective way of getting those bars up.
Okay. Any last questions for Steve? Yep, one more.
It's Simon Ward. Clearly there's going to be a tipping point between empowerment and efficiency, because obviously if you give people lots of control over things like where they sit and everything else, and you demonstrated the different patterns of where people move, there's going to come a point where people aren't working effectively in the business. They've got the empowerment, but they could do things in a better way, in a more efficient way. And you're going to go out beyond the bounds of, like small changes as something that's actually making a significant difference. How would you address that without constraining people too much?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
If you're empowering people to have a choice about how they go about doing things, how they travel around a building, there's going to be like a better way and a not so good way in terms of like the time taken to get from A to B or the steps that they take. And over time, that's going to build up in terms of lost productivity. So how would you manage that in a way without constraining people too much?
That's about making the environment work for the activities which people undertake. And as you've just said, a point I quite often make is people are like water. And I think Les mentioned something similar to this earlier. They'll take the path of least resistance. So you can't change some of those cultural things in people because that's human nature. So it comes back to a few of the points I've made. It's about making an environment which is flexible. Inevitably, when you move into a building, it will not be 100% right. There will be things which need to change. So it's making sure you've got the ability to change that. And even if you look at the last 5 to 10 years within business and the workplace, what technology and various other things have done, I couldn't confidently stand here and predict what an office should look like in even 5 years' time, because I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to see a kind of a seismic change. It's about, again, having that flexibility and making sure that the workplace is accommodating what the people want to do, rather than perhaps what we've all been guilty of for the last however many years, is of creating a workplace in a particular way and then telling people that's how they've got to behave.
Okay, well, squeeze one more in.
Yeah, hi, it's Craig Shepherd from FM Expert. You mentioned about the different flexibility between different companies, and a point raised earlier about Les O'Gorman about the cultures between different types of companies that people work for. How does the cultural aspect link into this? For example, your figures on utilisation were very similar to a report I did at the British Transport Police head office, and certain elements of the police force there, they'd earned their right for their private office, whereas all the people in the support services that support them were all just thrown in open plan offices. but that cultural difference within the company and then between different companies, how does that link in?
That's absolutely right. And if you look at a lot of the tech companies who are seen as the kind of the pioneers or the trailblazers in this, their leadership teams are generally of a different mindset than perhaps the client you've just talked about, perhaps some of the big banks I work with. Culture, I think, really stems from senior leadership, their perception, their attitudes and their behaviours. And there's been great examples, project I wasn't involved with, but when Barclays did their workplace transformation, where they had the absolute person at the top who was the sponsor of that. I've worked for other banking organisations where we haven't had that level of sponsorship, where it's not been so successful. And I think in terms of the culture, it's about having the senior leader engaged with what you're going to do.